I love your sister, my husband said. Did I mention I'm pregnant? Where do I even start? Last night, my husband, the man I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, sat across from me, drunk, looking like a sad, wet puppy, and dropped the bomb. He told me he's been in love with my sister for years. Years. Not weeks. Not months. Years. I can't even describe the way my stomach dropped when he said it. It felt like someone punched me right in the chest, but the pain didn't stop. It just stayed. I don't know why I didn't scream or throw something. Maybe because I was too busy trying to process the words. Or maybe I just froze because somewhere deep down I already knew. And that realization? That's what hurts the most. I think I've always known. Or at least suspected. Let me back up for a second so this makes a little more sense. My sister, Emily, and I grew up in a house that could best be described as a war zone. Our stepdad was a monster, plain and simple. He was controlling, mean, and, on his bad days, downright abusive. My mom? She was too weak, too scared, or too broken to fight back. So Emily did. Every single time. She was my shield, my rock, my everything. I can't count the number of times she'd step in between me and him, taking the brunt of his anger so I could hide. She was the one who whispered, "Don't cry. He can't win if you don't cry." And I believed her. When I was 17, she smuggled me out of that house and into her college dorm. She gave up her social life so I could sleep on a cot in her tiny room far away from him. She was my savior, my hero. And, for a long time, she was my whole world. Fast forward to now, and I guess you could say Emily's still kind of the golden standard in my life. She's smart, funny, beautiful, and just effortlessly good. The kind of person everyone gravitates toward. She's always been that way. And me? Well, I've always been the little sister. The one who followed behind her, who needed her. I guess that dynamic never really changed, even into adulthood. When I met my husband, Jake, I was so excited because, for the first time, I felt like I had something. Someone who wasn't Emily's shadow. Jake was sweet, steady, and kind of shy. He reminded me a little of Emily in the way he just cared. I thought I'd finally found someone who saw me, not just Emily's sister. But now? Now I don't even know what's real anymore. So yeah, there I was, sitting across from Jake after he just spilled his soul about being in love with my sister for years. It was like my brain split in two. One part of me was screaming, "How dare you?" While the other part was just numb, like I was watching it all happen from somewhere outside my body. The thing is, after everything we went through growing up, I thought I had finally escaped being the shadow of my sister. I thought Jake was someone who loved me for me. But the second he said those words, the old insecurities came flooding back. You know, those whispers in the back of your head that say, "You'll never be as good as her." I spent my whole life trying to shake that, and in one drunken confession, he ripped the scab right off. But before I get ahead of myself, let me rewind a little to give you some context. Jake and I hadn't been married that long, just over a year. I met him through a mutual friend, and what drew me to him was how steady and kind he seemed. He was quiet, but in a thoughtful way, like he was always paying attention. He had this calming presence, which honestly reminded me a lot of Emily. But I didn't think much of that back then. I just thought, hey, here's someone I can build a life with. And for a while, I really believed that. Jake proposed after 2 years of dating, and I was over the moon. Even Emily told me she thought he was a great guy, which, coming from her, felt like the ultimate stamp of approval. We had a small, simple wedding, nothing fancy, just close friends and family. Emily was my maid of honor, and she gave this beautiful speech about how proud she was of me for creating a life so different from the one we grew up in. It made me cry, but in a good way. At the time, it felt like I was finally stepping into my own, creating something that was truly mine. But now, looking back, I can't help but replay every little moment, searching for clues. Like, was Jake already in love with her back then? Was it there, hiding in the way he smiled at her during the wedding toast? Or the way he'd always go out of his way to make her laugh? I used to think it was sweet how much he cared about my family. Now it just feels like a betrayal I didn't see coming. The thing is, Emily had no idea. I know that for a fact. She's always been fiercely protective of me, even as adults. After everything we went through growing up, she made it her mission to ensure I had a better life. She's the one who got me out of that house, who let me crash in her college dorm, who gave up so much of her own life to make sure I could have mine. She's my sister, my best friend, my protector. So when Jake confessed his feelings for her, I didn't just feel betrayed by him. I felt like it was an attack on the one relationship I've always been able to count on. What really gets me is that this wasn't something that just happened. He didn't wake up one day and realize he had feelings for her. No, he carried this with him for years. Through our dating, our engagement, our wedding, through everything. And he never said a word. He just let it fester. After his confession, things got weird fast. I told him I needed time to process, and for a while we kind of danced around each other, trying to pretend everything was okay. But it wasn't. How could it be? I started noticing how he'd avoid looking at Emily when we were all together, like he was scared I'd catch him. And honestly, I think that hurt even more. Because if he was really over her, wouldn't he be able to act normal? Instead, it felt like this constant reminder that I could never measure up. At the same time, I couldn't bring myself to tell Emily. I didn't want to ruin her happiness, especially since she and Ryan had just gotten engaged. She looked so happy, so free, and I didn't want to taint that. So I kept it to myself, which, in hindsight, was probably a mistake. But what was I supposed to do? Say, "Hey, congrats on your engagement. By the way, my husband's in love with you." Yeah, no thanks. Jake and I started going to counseling not long after that. He insisted he wanted to make things work, that he loved me and wanted to be a good husband and father. And I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the trust was gone. Every time I looked at him, all I could see was the man who chose my sister, again and again in his heart, even if he didn't act on it. And then came the next blow. Emily announced she was pregnant. I remember the exact moment she told us. We were at her place for dinner, and she and Ryan had this whole adorable setup with little baby-themed cupcakes. I was thrilled for them, of course. I mean, I know how much Emily has wanted this. But the second I glanced at Jake's face, I knew something was wrong. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and he kept looking down at his plate like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. That night, after we got home, he broke down. He told me he couldn't keep pretending, that he felt like he was failing me, failing himself, failing everyone. He said he didn't know how to be the man I needed him to be when he couldn't even get his own feelings straight. It was like watching him unravel in real time, and I just stood there, quietly imploding on the inside. And that's when I realized, this wasn't something we could fix. Not really. That night, after Jake broke down, something in me just gave out. I didn't have the energy to argue or even cry anymore. I told him, quietly but firmly, if you're not willing to fight for us, then stop dragging me through this. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, wiped his face, and went to sleep on the couch. For the next few days, we barely spoke. It was like we were roommates in some weird limbo, waiting for someone to finally pull the plug. I guess I thought he'd snap out of it, that he'd realize he had a family on the way and try harder. But instead, he got worse. He started coming home late or not at all, spending hours locked in the basement or going for these long, aimless drives. He wasn't mean or angry, he was just gone. Like he'd already checked out. Then one night, he sat me down at the kitchen table and told me he'd made a decision. He said he wanted to let me go. Those were his exact words, like we were in some melodramatic movie. He said he wasn't the man I deserved, that he couldn't be a good husband or a good father when his heart was so confused. Confused. That's what he called it. As if that made it any better. But the part that really broke me, he said he wanted to leave before the baby was born. He thought it would be easier for me if he wasn't around, like cutting him out early would somehow make it less painful. And yeah, maybe he thought he was doing the noble thing, but all I heard was, "I'm leaving you and our child because I can't get over your sister." I didn't even argue with him. What was the point? I just sat there, staring at the man I thought I knew, wondering how the hell we got here. How did I end up married to someone who could walk away from his own kid? Someone who could sit there, calm as anything, and tell me he was giving up? The next day, I found out he'd reached out to Emily. He didn't tell me, of course. I found out because Emily called me, confused and upset. Apparently, Jake had texted her, asking if they could meet up one last time so he could say goodbye. Goodbye to what, exactly? To her? To whatever fantasy he'd been holding on to? I don't know, and honestly, I didn't care. The second I heard that, I saw red. I told Emily everything. There was no sugarcoating it this time. I told her about his confession, his feelings, his breakdowns, everything I'd been keeping bottled up for months. And to her credit, she was horrified. She kept apologizing, saying she had no idea, that she'd never meant to come between us. I believed her. I still do. But that didn't make it hurt any less. I told her not to meet him. I told her to cut him off completely, to block his number and never give him the chance to drag her into his mess. She agreed immediately, which was a relief, but it didn't erase the humiliation I felt. It was like I'd been stripped bare, my entire life laid out for her to see. Emily, my perfect, untouchable sister, now knew just how badly I'd failed. When Jake found out I'd warned her, he didn't even try to hide his disappointment. He just shrugged and said, "I figured you'd do that." Like it didn't even matter. Like he'd already made peace with losing her, losing me, losing everything. And maybe he had. Maybe he'd already decided that walking away was easier than facing the wreckage he created. I wish I could say I felt empowered in that moment, like I'd taken back control of the situation. But the truth is, I just felt empty. Jake was leaving, Emily was tangled up in the fallout, and I was left standing there, pregnant and alone, trying to make sense of a life that no longer felt like my own. After that, Jake started packing his things. There wasn't a big blowout or any dramatic goodbye scene, just silence. He moved into a friend's place across town, leaving behind a few boxes of random stuff he said he'd get later. I didn't ask where he was going or what he planned to do. I didn't care. As far as I was concerned, he'd already made his choice. But of course, life wasn't about to give me the grace of a clean break. A few days later, Emily called me again. She sounded hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should even be telling me this, but she said she thought I needed to know. Apparently, Jake had shown up at her office. Her office. Unannounced. During lunch. He told her he just wanted to see her one last time. She said he didn't stay long, maybe 10 minutes, but the fact that he even went there, knowing how much damage he'd already done, made me absolutely lose it. I mean, how selfish can one person be? He wasn't just leaving me and our unborn daughter. He was still trying to involve Emily, dragging her into his mess when she'd done nothing wrong. It wasn't fair to her, and it sure as hell wasn't fair to me. The thought of him sitting there, pouring his heart out to her while I was at home trying to figure out how to raise a child on my own, made me physically sick. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I called him. I hadn't spoken to him since he left, and I'd been trying to avoid any direct confrontation because, frankly, I didn't have the emotional bandwidth for it. But this crossed a line. When he picked up, I didn't even let him get a word in. I just let him have it. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I started, my voice shaking. "You've already destroyed our marriage, and now you're trying to drag Emily into this too? Do you even realize what you're doing? Or do you just not care?" He tried to defend himself, of course. Said he just wanted closure, that he needed to apologize to her, that it wasn't about me. And that's when I snapped. "Not about me?" I practically screamed into the phone. "You don't get to say that. You don't get to act like this is some personal journey you're on while the rest of us are left cleaning up the mess you made. You're a coward, Jake. You're running away because it's easier than staying and facing what you've done. But guess what? You don't get to take Emily down with you." He went quiet after that. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, but he didn't say anything. Finally, after what felt like forever, he muttered, "I'm sorry." And maybe he meant it. Maybe he really did feel bad for everything he'd put us through. But by then it didn't matter. No apology was going to undo the damage. I hung up before he could say anything else. I was done. Done with the excuses, done with the guilt trips, done with him. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was taking control, like I wasn't just some passive bystander in my own life. I told Emily what happened, and she reassured me that she wouldn't have anything to do with him again. I believed her. She'd always been my protector, and now it was my turn to protect her. From him, from this whole mess, from me. But even as I was cutting ties with Jake, I couldn't shake the anger I felt toward Emily. It wasn't fair, I know that. She didn't do anything wrong. But a part of me couldn't help but resent her, not for what she did, but for who she was. For being the person Jake couldn't let go of. For being the person everyone seemed to love more than me. Jake officially moved out a week later. He left a short note saying he was sorry and that he hoped I could forgive him someday. I threw it in the trash without reading the rest. I didn't need closure from him. I didn't want it. What I wanted, what I needed, was to figure out how to move forward without him. That's when I made the decision to leave. I'd been toying with the idea for a while, but after everything that happened, it felt like the only option. I needed a fresh start, somewhere far away from the memories and the pain. I told Emily I'd be moving to a new city before the baby was born, just temporarily. She was supportive, of course, but I could hear the worry in her voice. She wanted to help, to be there for me, but I couldn't let her. Not right now. Not when my feelings toward her were so complicated. So I packed up my things, found a small apartment in a new town, and started over. It wasn't easy. I was 7 months pregnant, emotionally wrecked, and completely alone. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life. No Jake. No Emily. Just me and my daughter building something new. It's been a few months now, and honestly, I'm still figuring it out. Some days are better than others. Some days I wake up and feel like I can handle anything. Other days, I cry over the stupidest things, like not being able to reach the top shelf or hearing a song that reminds me of the life I thought I'd have. But I'm getting there. Slowly but surely. I survived an abusive childhood, I survived a broken marriage, and I'll survive this too. My daughter deserves a mom who doesn't settle for less than she deserves. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that I deserve better. We both do.